Hi everyone, my name is Patrick Burke and I'm a chemistry lecturer at Newham College. And thanks for joining me for my presentation of my PGCE research on science versus religion in the classroom. Now, the science and religion debate has obviously gone on for a very long time, and even today it still causes a great deal of interest. And I think because whether you sit on the side of science or more on the side of religion, or even perhaps perfectly between the two, most people can identify with the relationship and are aware of the key points in the discussion. I think most people are aware of this because it is really relevant to our lives and how we live them. Now, sometimes this debate has causes some conflict. However, I think we need a different approach to how we think about science and religion together, particularly when dealing with students. And I'll try and show why I think we need a different approach and what approach I think we should be taking over the course of this presentation, as I think it presents a really great opportunity for enhancing learning here. I've done this research from the perspective of a science teacher, but really I'd hope that any teacher can find something in this to take away and to apply to their lessons. So to start off, the main inspiration for this course of research was this question, which was posed to me by a student in a level 2 class, who, when looking at the structure of atoms, posed to me why God would create atoms with incomplete shells. And I summoned up all my wit and my eloquence to come back with the response, that's a good question. I'll get back to you later. And I really had no intention of getting back to her later, and I hoped that the question wouldn't surface again, as I didn't really have an answer to it. And it got me thinking that this child had obviously had a problem during this lesson, had something she was unsure of, and so she quite rightly asked her teacher about it. And I was not prepared for this. My response was woefully inadequate. So it got me thinking about science and religion in the classroom, and how we're presenting this relationship and how students are dealing with the relationship of science and religion. I teach in Newham, which is an incredibly diverse borough of London, and it has very large religious populations within there. And certainly my students represent that. I have a great many religious students, mostly between Christianity and Islam. And so I thought, if this one student is suffering from these kind of questions and this sort of insecurity about the subject, then perhaps others might be as well. In the end, I started thinking about science and religion in the classroom, and just about science and religion as a whole. And when I started thinking about science and religion, and I've posed this question to quite a few other people as well, the same sort of ideas seem to surface. And when you think about them, you probably think about some kind of evolution or intelligent design when you think about science and religion. You might think about the Big Bang Theory or some type of creation. Or you might even think about when the dinosaurs were around. Now, all of these three things, these are the three key topics that most people seem to mention when they think about science and religion. And they're all representative of conflict between the two, of times when science and religion have disagreed or have held opposing positions in a debate. And really, I don't necessarily want people to think of science religion in that way, of it always being in conflict, because I don't think that's really representative when you look through history of science and religion and how they've got on. Yes, there have been differences, but I don't think that's all there is to both science and religion. So I wanted to sort of think about how students view both science and religion, and whether they see it as conflict as well. And eventually this stemmed into these main project aims. So I wanted to establish if students do feel a sense of conflict between their beliefs and what they're taught in class, and try and establish where this conflict might come from. And then obviously, if I'm going to discover that this might be a problem, I'd like to investigate what potential solutions there are to help reduce this sense of conflict as well. So to start off, I put a questionnaire to my students. Most of them were at AS level, studying chemistry. I just put a questionnaire to them with a few simple yes or no questions. So have you ever found conflict between science and your religion? By far the majority have done, almost 60% said that yes, they had found some conflict within their lessons. When asked if these lessons could be made more accessible to religious students, an even greater majority said that yes, they felt that they could. And this, I think, is a really important statistic because, particularly for me in Newham, as I mentioned, with such a large population of religious students, if 70% of them are feeling slightly excluded from my science lessons because they are not accessible to religious students, then that is a very worrying statistic. I obviously, as a teacher, want my lessons to be as inclusive and as accessible as possible. So for 70% to feel that that's not occurring, that to me says that something needs to change. Question number 3, do you think people can believe in their religion and believe in opposing scientific beliefs? And again, a very great majority said that yes, they think that they can. And this in many ways is quite encouraging, I think, because obviously these religious science students are open to having both views. They think that they can reach a harmonious point where there isn't a sense of conflict. However, judging by the other 2 questions, it seems they're not quite there yet. They are sensing conflict and they don't feel that these lessons are accessible, but they are open to the ideas being presented. So from the questionnaire, it threw up a few sort of worrying results, but also a few encouraging ones as well. Now, within the questionnaire, I also went on to give them a short answer question of how did this conflict make you feel? And there were a few positive ones in there, a few saying how they were curious or interested or challenged by the question. But by far and away, the majority were slightly more negative answers, saying about how students felt slightly annoyed, awkward, confused. One particularly worrying one saying that they would lead to being judged from their feelings on this conflict. And obviously these negative emotions are not things we want our students to be experiencing in this class. And if the majority of students are feeling conflict, then we could be in a position where the majority of students are feeling these kind of negative emotions. And again, for any teacher who wants their class to be as inclusive and a happy learning environment as possible, this is worrying feedback. So again, I wanted to view whether this conflict might be affecting students and what they're studying. So I gave the students a list of adjectives and said, how many of these adjectives would you choose to describe science? And then I obviously didn't want to know just about science. I want to know about science and religion and their relationship. So I posed the exact same list of adjectives and said, how many of these would you use to describe religion? And the results are shown here. The most, or the higher numbers are shown in yellow. And what is very clear to see is that if there is any conflict here, then religion is certainly coming out on top. I'd also like to stress at this point that when showing these numbers, this isn't about trying to get science's numbers to be larger than those of religion. It's not about getting any one to trump the other and become more popular than the other. The only real piece of interest, I think, in these statistics is again saying that if there is conflict, then obviously religion is coming out on top. And also the worryingly low numbers shown in terms of favourable adjectives used to describe science. Considering that these students are studying science at AS level, which is quite a high level, and many of them want to go on to university to consider these studies, continue these studies further, for them to say that only 21% think that science is fair, for only about 42% think that science is accurate, and for under 40% think that science is reliable, these are very worrying statistics. So there is an issue here from the perspective of a science teacher that a lot of these students are viewing science in a negative light, particularly in comparison to their beliefs. And this is, I think, damaging to their future within the subject. We want them to, if they're going to be studying science, we want them to have a positive view of it. Now, again, I'd stress here that this isn't the idea that religion is interfering with their science or their learning of science, or in any ways that religion is a hindrance to learning science, because I don't think it is. what I think is hindering them is the conflict. As you said, most students are open to the idea of having the two beliefs, of having both science and religion as beliefs. But clearly this is not coming through in how they view these subjects. So finally, I asked how this conflict or sense of conflict makes students feel towards their subject. And actually most of the answers were quite positive here. Quite a few of them were intrigued and tried to learn more about science, found it more fun and interesting, interested to explore other opinions. So there was a great deal of intrigue and of interest towards the debate, and that's quite encouraging. A few of the more worrying answers were when students said that the subject made them feel nothing. They'll just take in the information to pass the exam and then forget it afterwards. Now again, with these students going on to study science at university, particularly those of them that want to go on and do medicine, we don't really want them thinking of science as something that you take in to pass an exam and then forget afterwards. I certainly don't want my future doctors to have taken in the information they've learned and then forgotten it as soon as they've passed their exams. So here I think this represents how this conflict could be interfering with their learning, and that this is something that we need to address. So overall, the conclusions I drew from this questionnaire were that yes, the majority of students do feel a sense of conflict, that this conflict is causing some distress and affecting learning and perceptions of science in particular. But students are interested in the science and religion relationship, and that they are open to the ideas presented both by their religion and by the science that they learn at school and at college. So as I mentioned, I don't just want to investigate whether there is a sense of conflict. I wanted to investigate some potential methods that could be used to help this. And from the questionnaire responses, I came up with these three different approaches. Now, some of these have been sourced from other areas, from other books, and certainly inspired by other views and other scientific papers. Some of them I came up with myself. But the three different approaches I had: the first, the nature of scientific inquiry. Now, this is the idea that some students may reject these scientific ideas, partly because they don't really know where they came from or how these scientific ideas and theories came to be. So I thought something to show the evidence-based approach of scientific inquiry and how these ideas came to fruition and came to be developed might help destroy some of the fear or some of the mystery around them, that rather than just saying this is a scientific theory that you have to learn and agree with, we can say, well, this is the idea, this is how it came about. The second approach I thought was the alternative views to science within religions. So obviously within religions, some followers are more hardline and they will reject scientific views just on the principle of their religion. But actually within most religions there are very alternative views to science. Some will be very open to it, and indeed there is a massive population of religious scientists. So clearly it's along a spectrum that lots of people can entertain both scientific views and religious views. So that is a short presentation based around those views. And finally, what religion and science have accomplished together. As I mentioned at the start, science and religion are quite often thought of in terms of conflict, but actually over the years science and religion have accomplished an awful lot together, and religious scientists have contributed a massive amount to our modern day scientific thinking. So I think highlighting that can again sort of dispel the myth that science and religion are always in conflict. So the nature of scientific inquiry, this took the form of an activity whereby students were given a box, and you can see the layout of the box on screen now. So when given the box, I would place it on the table with this bottom side saying Francine, obviously on the table, and students were not able to see the bottom of the cube. The students weren't able to touch the cube or move the cube in any way. They were just had to look at the various sides of the cube and try and work out what is on the bottom. So from looking at it, they could see that on two opposing sides of the cube, the two opposing sides both had white faces. And again, on another two opposing sides, they both had blue faces. On the top of the square, the top square was red, so they could make the evidence-based assumption that the bottom square would also be red. You also see that both names on opposite sides begin with the same letter, that one is male, one is female. And there's also patterns in the numbers as well. Some count the number of letters within the name. So using all of this evidence, students are able to form a theory about what they think is on the bottom of this cube. And students really warmed to this. They really took to it. They enjoyed the puzzle of trying to figure out what was on the bottom of this cube. And then were able to get very close to the right answers, both in terms of colour, name, and the numbers as well. Now, when presenting this, I found it particularly enjoyable before revealing the answer, to take the cube away and say, well, it's sometimes in science you never find out the definite answer here. You just have to go with the evidence and the conclusions that you've made and trust that they're correct. And I think at first this caused a lot of objection from the students, but I think they eventually really warmed to the idea that you might never know an absolute answer to your question, but you can still trust that what you've concluded is correct based on the evidence that you've seen. And eventually I did soften and I showed them the answer at the end, and they were very happy, those that got there and found the result. And I tried to put forward the message that, well, think about how happy you are that you've put in all this work and you've, based on all the evidence, you've solved the puzzle. And again, this is a lot about a lot of what science is about, really. So yeah, this activity went down really, really well, and I'll show you some of the feedback to it near the end of the presentation. So secondly, I also gave a brief presentation about the alternative views to science within religion. I've just got a few screenshots of this now. So one of the ideas I put forward to students was how this relationship can be viewed as tackling different questions. So science will tackle more how and when questions, whereas religion is about who and why. So really it's the idea that it's quite unfair to ask a scientist or someone looking into the origins of the universe, who created the universe or why is it here? Because that's not really what science is trying to investigate. And again, it might be unfair to ask any religious authority exactly how the universe began or when did it happen. Because again, religion can be seen as tackling something different, as tackling different questions about a different aspect of this debate. Sort of following on from this is the idea that there are two different books. There's the book of God's Word and also the book of God's works. God's Word being scriptures or the Bible, the book of God's works being nature. And that really we should try to have a knowledge and an understanding of both. So we shouldn't base everything we know just on what's written in the Bible, but at the same time we shouldn't base everything we know just on what we've observed in nature. Again, as I said following before, they tackle different, science and religion can be seen as tackling different questions, and we need to have an understanding of both science and religion in order to answer all of the questions that we present. And I found this Francis Bacon quote to be particularly apt as a leader in creating scientific method, including quotes like this. And there are a few quotes from notable scientists and notable authorities throughout the presentation, just to try and give some history and some aspect of philosophy into this debate, and the students responded well to it. As I mentioned, most of the students in my class were either Christian or Islam. So I tried to make the presentation cater for both. So here's an example of some of the slides that appealed to Muslim students. How the quest for knowledge is obligatory for every Muslim. Every Muslim is given the role of Khalifa and is endowed with the duty and the power to care for the earth and its resources. And I tried to tie this in with one of the key concepts that we'd tackled in AS chemistry this year, of green chemistry, of how, yes, the Quran does say that we should be looking after the world, and that green chemistry is an excellent way to do this. A lot of the ideas taken here throughout the arguments with Christianity and Islam and how they relate to science, a lot of them have been taken from the books by Michael Poole, who's written extensively on science and religion. Is based at King's College London. A lot of his ideas have gone into these presentations, so those books are very, very worthwhile, and I recommended them to students as well if they wanted to look into this more. And finally, just something that was applicable to both Christian and Muslim students was the idea of proving stuff. Now, science can actually struggle to prove things indefinitely. Science probably tackles things more to do with probability than with absolute proofs. When we talk about gravity, you can say that when I throw this pen up in the air, it will return to the ground, but actually we can't say that there's any proof that it will return to the ground. I could throw it up in the air and it will stay there. We don't know. What we're basing that on is what is probable. We can say that it is probably going to fall back to the ground. But we don't actually have any stone cold proof that it will. Again, it can be difficult for religion to prove things as well. As it says here, prove to me theologically that atoms exist. There's no real way for anyone within theology to do that. So it's difficult on both sides for any real proof to be certain of. And I was putting this idea across to students that if anyone tries to insist that this is proved, either from science or religion, that anything is proved, that this is still something we can question. So finally, what science and religion have accomplished together? Again, going back through history, the relationship hasn't been anywhere near as fractious as is often portrayed. So this took the form of an activity where students had to put together famous scientists and their discoveries. So here I have a list of 8 famous Christian scientists. So the students would recognise a few names, not necessarily all of them, and try and match them up with some of their discoveries. Now I tried to choose scientists who had also contributed something to religion as well. So there's some who spoke or wrote at length about the science and religion relationship. When students see some of the ideas that have been coined or generated by religious scientists, they really make a link to, like, oh, okay, so religion does not exclude you from science. They can actually be incredibly productive together. As I said, I've got a mix of Christian and Muslim students, so I tried to make a resource catering towards Muslim students as well. Quite a few of these names are not quite as recognisable as the Christian ones. The golden age of science for Islam really was quite a long time ago, around 1000 AD. So some of the discoveries have been built on since then, and so the original names aren't quite as recognisable. But still, students had fun trying to match them up. It was quite a lot of guesswork, but still they eventually got there in the end after some coaxing. And also I tried to include some female scientists here as well, try and show that it's not just men in science, that female scientists and female Muslim scientists are also making massive contributions to science as well. So it's much like before, they had to match them up to their discoveries. And again, I think this really hit home how much science and religion have accomplished together. And the feedback I got for it was, again, very positive. It's funny, after I'd created all of these resources, I put them towards a small focus group of 5 students. Now, to start the focus group, we had a discussion on science and religion, and this mainly based around my prompting with the questions. So what do you think of when you think of science? And then what do you think of when you think of religion? And building from there. And then after this brief discussion, I asked the students to place themselves on a scale using these 4 categories on screen now: contradictory, negotiated, unexplored, and unknowable. Now, this is a scale of epistemic insight, and this was a scale and term coined by Billingsley et al., who did some research in 2013 around science and religion in the classroom. And they created this scale, and I thought I'd use this and ask students to measure themselves. So before showing them any of these resources, you can see that quite a few of them place themselves in the contradictory category, or somewhere between contradictory and negotiated. So contradictory obviously meaning that they think that science and religion hold opposing beliefs, and that there is massive contradiction between the two, and that one will ultimately be rejected. Negotiated meaning that they accept that there are different views, but that they have found a way to get on board with both of the ideas and carry on in a harmonious position with both of them. Unexplored, meaning that they haven't really thought about it, and unknowable, meaning that they think that there's no real answer to any of these questions, and so there's not much point in looking into them. So this was their stance beforehand. So during the questioning, there was some insinuation that they thought that yes, there could be some harmony here. All of the students here entered into this voluntarily. None of them were forced into it. So it's understandable that some of those that are so willing to engage in this discussion would also be some of the more open-minded students. So it's unsurprising that some came out with this quote in particular to say that you need to think outside of the box and look into other opinions. You can't be so hard-headed as to just dismiss things straight away, which was an interesting perspective for him to take. He obviously sat slightly more towards the negotiated category. Some of the more contradictory viewpoints focus around this sort of quote, that I don't tend to focus on those things, I don't tend to think about them because I know it's not something I believe in. So that is someone who's slightly more towards the contradictory, who's starting to reject this idea that disagreed with what she believed in. Also from the discussion came out some very useful ideas about keeping science and religion separate, and how this is how science and religion have been tackled in their schools beforehand. And one had a very interesting story about how she was actually picked on at school because when it came out in a science lesson that she was religious and didn't embrace the ideas that were being presented, the teachers didn't really deal with it. They just said, oh, we can't really do anything about that, it's what they believe. And that was it. And as a result, these students suffered at the hands of their peers because of it. So this is obviously a very prime example of why I think we need a different approach to this, and why this science and religion debate needs to be raised in a slightly different way. Another student had an anecdote about how he had a Muslim physics teacher, and he asked a question about the Big Bang Theory and how this physics teacher had found any harmony between the two ideas. And this teacher took him to one side after the lesson and explained his position, and he really enjoyed that, and it was obviously a very powerful memory for him. So I think that those two anecdotes really showed how keeping science and religion completely separate isn't a productive way to deal with it in the classroom, and that we need to be using these kind of ideas and this kind of open discussion to take things forward. So after the activities, I asked the students to place themselves on the scale again and see whether they had changed their position. And all students had moved towards a more negotiated position. Now, I'd highlighted negotiated before, as I think this is the optimum area that I think we should be aiming for, that we want students to find a harmony and a middle ground between everything, so that they don't feel this sense of conflict, which, as I showed at the start, can be seen as interfering and as having a negative impact on their learning of science. So the feedback to the tasks was, on the whole, very, very positive. And I think of these three quotes, the third, I think, epitomises what we're really aiming for, or what I was aiming for in this research. So many theories have come as an outcome of science and religion, which has bettered our understanding of the world we believe God has given us. So this sums up someone who has taken a more negotiated position, that she's seen how science and religion have worked together in the past, and she's still hanging on to her belief that God has created the world, which is great. We don't want to insist upon people having to change their beliefs. That's not what this research is about. I want people to be able to have their beliefs and to hang on to those, but also embrace these scientific ideas. And I think this quote sums up the position of someone who is at least starting to do that, even if not completely. So finally, to conclude, I think that this research has shown that many religious students experience conflict in science lessons, and that this conflict can affect their learning. Again, I'd stress that it's not the fact that their religion is interfering with their learning, but that this sense of conflict is interfering. Students are willing and open to discussing the science and religion relationship. From all of the near 50 students that I presented the questionnaire to, only one or two said that they didn't want to participate. So I think on the whole, students do want this discussion, and I think it's important that we, as teachers, start embracing it with them. And finally, I think that the methods I used here were effective in opening up the discussion and helping to reduce those feelings of conflict. Certainly the feedback that I got back was very positive, saying that yes, students did feel that they had got to a more negotiated position, and that they enjoyed and were interested and in many ways invigorated by having this discussion. So I don't think it's something that we should shy away from or be afraid of. I think it's something we should be embracing. Perhaps for too long we've shied away from it because of some kind of spiritual sensitivity, that we're worried about offending someone, or getting into an argument with someone because they hold such hardline scientific or religious beliefs. But I think burying our head in the sands is not productive, and it's not something that we, particularly as teachers, can do if we want to create inclusive and accessible lessons that religious students can enjoy and can get the most out of. Because again, if we want these students to go on and to continue to learn science in the future, then they need to be able to access these ideas. So this is the debate as a whole. Thank you very much for listening. And with it in mind that I want to open up the discussion, I would of course welcome any and all questions, and I would do my best to answer them. So thank you very much for listening.